She gave food and gifts to a grieving elderly man on Christmas. An hour later, his lawyers knocked. The sharp chill of Christmas morning cut through the air as Ava pulled her threadbare coat tighter around her. The small apartment she called home, tucked into a quiet corner of Philadelphia, offered little warmth against the biting cold. Her Christmas tree was no more than a few pine branches she'd gathered from a park nearby, decorated with hand-me-down ornaments and a string of lights that flickered inconsistently. For weeks, Ava had wrestled with the weight of her circumstances. Once a diligent office assistant, she'd been let go under circumstances that felt more personal than professional. Her employer, a smug, middle-aged executive, dismissed her after a small disagreement about unpaid overtime. When Ava tried to contest the decision, her severance vanished like a mirage. Bills piled up, savings dwindled, and yet she had clung to hope, fragile as it was. Today, Ava resolved to start differently. The faint sound of church bells drew her toward the small community church on the corner. The congregation was sparse but familiar, the kind of people who shared nods of acknowledgement rather than words. Ava knelt at the pew, folding her hands. Her prayer was simple and sincere: strength to face another day and for kindness to endure in the world, despite everything. As she left the church, her thoughts drifted to the little luxury she'd planned for herself: lunch at an Italian restaurant downtown. She had saved for months to afford it, a single indulgence in an otherwise austere season. The thought lifted her spirits, if only for a moment. But as she crossed the courtyard, her eyes landed on a man sitting alone on a weathered bench. He was elderly, his back slightly hunched, wearing a wool coat that had seen better days. His head bowed, his shoulders shook with the unmistakable tremble of someone holding back sobs. Ava slowed, her chest tightening. She hesitated. Philadelphia was no stranger to people in need, and Ava had often been told to keep her distance. But something about the man, his loneliness so palpable, his grief so raw, compelled her to stop. "Excuse me," she said softly, approaching. "Are you all right?" The man looked up, startled by her presence. His face, lined with age and sorrow, bore a kind of quiet dignity. He fumbled for words, his voice hoarse. "It's nothing, miss. Just an old man feeling sorry for himself." Ava sat beside him, undeterred. Sometimes it helps to talk. He hesitated, then spoke haltingly. "It's Christmas, you know. I thought I'd be spending it with my son and grandson, but they didn't want me there." His voice broke, and he turned his face away. Ava felt a pang in her chest. She didn't pry, sensing the wound was too fresh. Instead, she offered him a small smile. "You don't have to be alone today." The man turned back to her, surprised. "What do you mean?" "Come have lunch with me," she said, her voice warm. "It's not much, just something I'd planned for myself, but I'd be happy to share it." He blinked, his eyes welling up. "You don't even know me." "Sometimes we don't need to know someone to be kind." The man hesitated, then nodded. "I'd like that, thank you." Before they left, Ava ducked into a corner store and bought 2 steaming cups of coffee, a sandwich, and a small Christmas card. On the card, she wrote in neat cursive, "You are not alone. Merry Christmas." She handed it to him as they walked to her modest apartment, his trembling hands holding the cup of coffee tightly. Inside her small but tidy living room, Ava lit a single candle on her makeshift tree. They sat together at her worn dining table, sharing simple food and heartfelt conversation. Ava learned his name, Leonard, and listened as he spoke of happier times when his family had been close. In turn, she shared her story, her voice steady but tinged with frustration as she recounted her struggle for fairness at her former job. Leonard listened intently, his gaze thoughtful. "You're stronger than you think," he said, "and kinder than most." They talked long into the afternoon, their connection deepening over shared pain and unspoken understanding. As the evening approached, Leonard stood to leave, thanking Ava repeatedly for her generosity. But as he stepped out into the cold night air, his mind buzzed with thoughts. He glanced back at the small apartment, its faint light glowing against the dark city. Something stirred within him, a determination he hadn't felt in years. Ava's apartment grew quiet after Leonard left, the faint hum of her refrigerator the only sound breaking the stillness. She tidied the table, her mind lingering on the unusual warmth their shared meal had brought to an otherwise lonely day. For a moment, her own struggles seemed smaller, eclipsed by the simple joy of connecting with someone who needed her kindness as much as she needed his company. The hours passed slowly, and Ava curled up on her worn sofa with a thin blanket. She tried to focus on a Christmas movie playing on her aging television, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Leonard. There was a heaviness in his eyes, a weariness that mirrored her own, though his was born of estrangement, hers of hardship. The weight of it all left her restless. Leonard, meanwhile, was walking the snow-dusted streets of Philadelphia, his breath visible in the frigid night. He hadn't planned on spending the day with anyone. For years, Christmas had been a time for family, a boisterous celebration with laughter, food, and the warmth of his son and grandson. But that warmth had slowly faded, replaced by resentment and distance. His son's last words to him rang in his ears. "We don't need you meddling in our lives anymore, Dad." He tightened his coat and pushed the thought away, but his mind circled back to Ava. Her generosity had caught him off guard. Here was a young woman barely scraping by, who had no reason to invite a stranger into her home. Yet she had without hesitation. And what's more, she had listened, really listened to him. Leonard hadn't realized how much he needed that. Back at her apartment, Ava finally drifted into a fitful sleep, her dreams fragmented. She saw herself standing in her old office, arguing with her boss. She relived the moment when her paycheck was withheld, her protests ignored, the humiliation, the desperation. She awoke with a start, her heart racing. The knock on her door came just as she was gathering herself. At first, Ava thought she had imagined it, but it came again, louder this time. She stood, unsure. Visitors were rare, especially late at night. Wrapping her blanket around her shoulders, she approached the door cautiously. When she opened it, her breath caught. Leonard stood there, but he wasn't alone. Flanking him were two sharply dressed men in tailored coats, their presence commanding and professional. Ava's eyes darted between them, her confusion clear. "Leonard," she asked, her voice uncertain. "What's going on?" Leonard stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Ava, I know it's late and I hate to disturb you, but I couldn't leave things the way they were." One of the men handed her an envelope, thick and pristine. Ava hesitated before taking it, her fingers trembling. She opened it carefully, her eyes widening as she saw what was inside. Cash. A lot of it. Her voice faltered. I don't understand." Leonard smiled gently. "You didn't ask for anything, Ava. You gave selflessly. That's rare in this world, and it deserves recognition." He motioned to the men beside him. "These are my attorneys. I run a law firm, a rather successful one, and when you told me about how you were treated by your former employer, I knew I had to do something." Ava shook her head, overwhelmed. I don't need charity." "This isn't charity," Leonard replied firmly. "This is justice. My team will help you file a lawsuit against that company. You have rights, Ava, and they violated them. We'll make sure you get what you're owed, and more." She stared at him, her mind spinning. "But why? You barely know me." Leonard's expression softened. "Because kindness should be repaid with kindness. And because you reminded me of something I'd forgotten, a belief in the goodness of people, even when life makes it hard to hold on to." Tears pricked Ava's eyes, but she blinked them back, nodding slowly. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll fight," Leonard said, his voice steady. "Say you won't give up." Ava looked at him, her resolve hardening. For the first time in months, she felt the faint stirrings of hope. "I'll fight," she whispered, her voice growing stronger. "I'll fight." Leonard nodded, satisfaction glinting in his eyes. "Good. Let's get started." Ava stood by her apartment window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The envelope Leonard had given her sat on the kitchen table, untouched since his departure. It felt surreal, as though the events of the past few hours were some elaborate dream. but the attorney's contact cards and the neatly organized documents inside the envelope confirmed that it was all very real. The next morning, Ava arrived at the downtown law firm Leonard owned. The office was a far cry from her modest apartment, sleek, modern, and bustling with energy. She was ushered into a large conference room where Leonard waited with a team of attorneys. He greeted her warmly, his demeanor professional but reassuring. "We've reviewed the details of your case," Leonard began. "Your former employer violated labor laws by withholding your pay and firing you without cause. This is an open and shut case, Ava. We're confident we can not only recover your wages, but secure damages for emotional distress." Ava listened intently as the attorneys outlined their strategy, their confidence contagious. For the first time in months, she felt like she had an advocate, a team fighting for her. As the meeting progressed, she realized the enormity of what Leonard was offering, a chance to reclaim not just her rights, but her dignity. Leonard stayed behind after the meeting, sensing Ava needed to talk. "How are you feeling?" he asked. She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Nervous? Grateful? Honestly, it's a mix of everything." "That's normal," Leonard said. "But you've already taken the hardest step, believing you're worth fighting for." As the legal process unfolded, Ava found herself growing stronger. The attorneys worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and preparing a case so airtight that her former employer's legal team quickly sought a settlement. But Leonard wasn't one to settle for the bare minimum. "This isn't just about the money they owe you," he explained during one of their meetings. "It's about holding them accountable. People like you deserve better." Weeks turned into months, and Ava's determination grew. She began to find small joys again, taking walks in the park, volunteering at a local food bank, reconnecting with her love for sketching, a hobby she'd abandoned during her struggles. Her life wasn't perfect, but it was no longer stagnant. Throughout the process, Leonard became more than just an ally. He became a friend. He shared stories of his own hardships, building his law firm from nothing, navigating personal losses, and dealing with the strained relationship with his son. These conversations created a bond between them, one built on mutual respect and understanding. The day of the court hearing arrived, though it was more ceremonial than confrontational. Leonard's team had built such a strong case that Ava's former employer agreed to a settlement just hours before proceedings began. Ava walked into the courtroom as a formality, her heart pounding but her head held high. When the judge finalized the agreement, Ava felt a wave of relief and triumph wash over her. Leonard was by her side as she exited the courthouse, a quiet smile on his face. "You did it," he said simply. "No," Ava replied, looking at him. "We did it." As they parted ways that evening, Leonard handed her another envelope. "This is something extra," he said, "to give you a head start." Ava opened it to find a check with a substantial sum, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Leonard, I can't—" "You can," he interrupted gently, "because you'll use it well. And because your kindness changed my life too." That night, as Ava sat in her apartment, she thought about how much had changed since that snowy Christmas morning. A simple act of compassion had set in motion a chain of events she never could have imagined, and it all led back to the moment she chose to stop for a grieving stranger. Months passed, and Ava's life began to take on a rhythm she had almost forgotten, one of stability and hope. With the settlement money and the additional funds Leonard had given her, she was able to pay off her overdue bills, restock her pantry, and even replace her worn-out coat. It wasn't just about the material changes, though. It was about reclaiming her sense of self-worth. Ava used a portion of the money to enroll in evening classes at a local community college, reigniting her dream of becoming a graphic designer. She spent her days sketching in the park, her confidence growing with every stroke of her pencil. The world, once so heavy and unyielding, now seemed full of possibility. Leonard continued to visit her from time to time, their bond evolving into a friendship that felt more like family. One Sunday afternoon, he arrived at her apartment carrying a small box wrapped in festive paper. "It's early for Christmas," Ava teased, accepting the gift. "It's not for Christmas," Leonard replied with a grin. "It's for you." Inside the box was a high-quality sketchbook and a set of professional-grade pencils. Ava's eyes filled with tears as she ran her fingers over the smooth pages. "Leonard, this is too much. Not for someone with your talent," he said, his tone encouraging. "I expect to see your work in galleries someday." As their friendship deepened, Leonard also found his own life changing. Inspired by Ava's resilience and the connection they'd built, he reached out to his son. The first conversation was strained, but over time they began to rebuild what had been broken. Leonard often credited Ava's kindness for giving him the courage to mend those bonds. The culmination of their journey came when Ava received the final settlement from her lawsuit. The amount was more than she could have imagined, enough to not only cover her losses but to secure a brighter future. With Leonard's encouragement, she invested in a small art studio, a space where she could create and teach classes to others in her community. Her first open house was a modest affair, attended by friends, neighbors, and a few curious passers-by. Leonard was there, of course, standing proudly in the corner as Ava welcomed her guests. The room was filled with her artwork, pieces that reflected not just her talent, but the journey she had taken to reclaim her life. Toward the end of the evening, Leonard pulled Ava aside. "Do you realize how far you've come?" he asked, his voice quiet, but full of pride. Ava smiled, her heart full. "I couldn't have done it without you." Leonard shook his head. "You could have, Ava. You had everything you needed inside you. I just gave you a little push." As the night wound down, Ava stood in her studio, looking out the window at the city lights. She thought back to that Christmas morning when she had first met Leonard, a lonely man sitting on a bench, and to the moment she decided to stop and offer her help. It had been such a small act, yet it had changed everything, for both of them. Ava's voice, though quiet, carried conviction as she spoke to herself. Kindness matters. It always matters.